It ended in 11 seconds. Not because anyone fell. Not because a punch landed cleanly. Witnesses would later struggle to explain what they saw, only what they felt afterward. A sudden quiet, an unspoken agreement that something had been settled. The challenger arrived certain of his reputation. Bruce Lee left without raising his voice. What happened in between was never advertised, rarely described, and never repeated the same way twice. But the outcome became unavoidable. The room was not large. Those who remembered it rarely agreed on its exact dimensions, only on how it felt once it filled. Low ceiling, plain walls, a floor worn smooth by repetition rather than ceremony. It was not a place designed to impress. It was a place designed to work. On most days it remained quiet. Training happened without spectators, without announcement. But that afternoon people arrived early. Not together and not by invitation. They came because something unnamed had already begun to circulate. Reputations have a way of doing that. The men who gathered understood hierarchy long before anyone spoke of it. Some had fought publicly. Others had taught for years. A few were known simply because no one challenged them anymore. They leaned against the walls, sat on the floor, stood with arms folded. Not posturing, just waiting. This was not an audience. It was a measuring room. Bruce Lee was already there. Several witnesses would later say they nearly missed him at first. He was not centered, not elevated. He moved through his warm-up with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. No wasted motion, no performance. His clothing was plain, his expression neutral. If there was anticipation in him, it did not surface. He acknowledged people with small nods. No speeches, no instructions beyond what was necessary. Those who trained with him recognized this version of him immediately. This was how he always looked before something important. Not tense, not relaxed. Simply prepared. The room adjusted around him without instruction. Conversations softened. Laughter disappeared. Even those who doubted him instinctively lowered their voices. Authority in that space did not announce itself. It exerted pressure quietly, like air thickening before a storm no one yet named. Outside, the challenger was still on his way. Inside, no one spoke of it directly, but everyone knew why they were there. A line was about to be tested, not by paperwork or rank, but by proximity, by contact, by truth under pressure. Bruce Lee finished warming up and stood still. Not in a stance. Not in readiness meant to be seen. Just stillness. Observers later described it as unsettling, not because it looked dangerous, but because it looked complete. As though nothing more needed to be added. One witness would say years later that this was the moment the outcome became inevitable. Not because of confidence. Because of absence of urgency, absence of fear, absence of anything that needed proving. When the door finally opened, the sound cut through the room sharper than expected. The challenger entered carrying certainty with him. Years of validation. A reputation built loudly and defended often. He did not scan the room. He knew where to look. Bruce Lee turned toward him calmly. No greeting followed. No explanation was offered. The room did not shift again. It had already chosen to watch. The challenger did not raise his voice. Those who expected anger were surprised by restraint, though the tension beneath it was unmistakable. His confidence did not come from arrogance alone. It came from history, from wins spoken about repeatedly, from rooms where his presence had already decided the outcome. He stood with the posture of someone accustomed to being acknowledged. Several in the room recognized him immediately, not as a myth but as a known quantity, a man who had tested himself publicly and survived the judgment that followed. His style was aggressive, direct, unapologetic, effective in the environments that rewarded force and certainty. He had not come to learn. He had come because silence had begun to feel like disrespect. The challenge, when it finally surfaced, did not take the shape of an announcement. It emerged through implication, through stance, through proximity, through the way he positioned himself directly across from Bruce Lee without asking permission. A few breaths passed. Bruce Lee met his eyes briefly, then looked away, not dismissively, but as though the matter required no sustained attention. To some, this felt insulting. To others, it felt instructional. The difference lay in experience. The challenger spoke then. Not many words. Enough to clarify intention. Enough to make retreat socially impossible. It was framed as curiosity, but it carried the edge of demand. Witnesses later disagreed on the exact phrasing. What they agreed on was the tone, measured, controlled, but carrying weight. This was not a man losing control. This was a man applying pressure. Bruce Lee listened without interruption. There was no visible calculation on his face. No tightening of the jaw. No shift in posture meant to signal readiness. When the challenger finished speaking, Bruce Lee paused, not theatrically but naturally, as if allowing the words to finish settling before deciding they had no further use. He nodded once. Not acceptance. Not defiance. Simply acknowledgement. What followed was practical. Bruce Lee gestured toward open space on the floor. No bow. No ritual. No attempt to elevate the moment beyond what it was. This was not ceremony. This was clarification. The challenger hesitated, just briefly. It was the first sign anyone noticed. Not doubt exactly. More like recalibration. The absence of spectacle disrupted his expectation. Challenges, in his experience, escalated. They were loud. They drew lines. They involved witnesses affirming stakes. Here, the stakes were implied, not announced. As the two men faced each other, something subtle shifted in the room. People leaned forward slightly. Breathing patterns changed. No one spoke. The walls seemed closer now, as though the space itself had condensed around the center. Bruce Lee stood neutrally, weight balanced, hands loose, not inviting attack, not preparing defense, just present. The challenger squared his shoulders. He had come prepared to dominate a moment. What he encountered instead was a man who did not recognize the moment as special. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him. The room waited not for impact, but for confirmation. No one announced that it was about to begin. There was no signal, no referee, no formal agreement spoken aloud. Yet every person in the room understood that the space between the two men had become the center. Not by designation, but by gravity. Those closest stepped back without being asked. Others adjusted their stance, shifting weight from one foot to the other, as if preparing for something that required balance rather than distance. The room was quiet now in a way that felt deliberate, almost respectful. Attention has a sound when it gathers. It is not loud. It is compressed. The challenger moved first, not forward, but into himself. His shoulders tightened slightly. His breathing deepened. Years of habit took over, shaping his posture into something recognizable to anyone who had seen him fight before. This was how he prepared to impose will. This was how he had always begun. Bruce Lee did not mirror him. He remained loose, almost informal, as though still warming up. To an untrained eye, it might have looked careless. To those who understood movement, it looked economical. Nothing engaged that did not need to be. Nothing tensed in anticipation. A witness standing near the back would later say this was when the room divided. Not physically, but perceptually. Some watched the challenger, tracking muscle and intention, waiting for the obvious initiation. Others found themselves unable to look away from Bruce Lee, not because he demanded attention, but because he did not. His stillness functioned like a question no one else could answer. The challenger circled half a step, testing distance, testing reaction. He was accustomed to reading fear or aggression in response. He found neither. Bruce Lee adjusted once, barely. A shift of weight so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for its timing. Closed nothing. Threatened nothing. It simply aligned him more precisely with the space he occupied. The challenger paused again. This time it was noticeable. The pause was not tactical. It was interpretive. He was trying to understand what he was seeing, and the delay cost him momentum. The room felt it. A few observers later described a subtle discomfort at this point. Not anticipation but uncertainty. The usual rhythm of confrontation had been disrupted. Bruce Lee's gaze lifted briefly, then softened again. He did not stare. He did not challenge. It was the look of someone watching a process rather than an opponent. In that moment, authority in the room began to separate from reputation. The challenger was still respected, still dangerous, still capable, but something else was emerging, something quieter, harder to define, a presence that did not seek dominance, yet seemed to render it unnecessary. No one moved. The tension did not rise. It narrowed, and within that narrowing the outcome began to take shape, though no one could yet explain how. Not even the man who had come to test it. There was no clear beginning. Those who tried to mark the first moment later disagreed. Some said it started when the challenger shifted his lead foot. Others believed it began with a breath Bruce Lee took that no one noticed until afterward. What everyone agreed on was that there was no dramatic initiation, no shout, no sudden rush meant to claim momentum. Action emerged the way truth sometimes does, without announcement. The challenger committed first. Not recklessly, not wildly. It was a controlled advance shaped by years of successful application. His movement carried intent and confidence, designed to overwhelm space and force reaction. Bruce Lee did not retreat. He moved, but not backward, not sideways. His adjustment was inward, into the moment, closing distance without appearing to. Observers later struggled to describe this part. The words never quite fit. They spoke of angles that seemed to appear rather than be taken, of timing that felt less like speed and more like absence of delay. There was contact, not the kind that echoed, not the kind that drew gasps. It happened close, almost quietly, limbs intersecting briefly before separating again. To the untrained eye, it might have looked incomplete, even restrained, but those nearest felt the shift immediately. The challenger's forward pressure dissolved. Not stopped. Not blocked. Simply redirected into nothing useful. Bruce Lee's movements were minimal. So minimal that several witnesses only realized something decisive had occurred when the challenger's posture changed. His shoulders were no longer squared. His balance was present, but compromised, as if his internal map of the exchange no longer matched reality. Another adjustment followed. Smaller still. Bruce Lee remained upright, composed, his breathing unchanged. He did not pursue. He did not escalate. Each motion served only one purpose, to clarify control. The challenger attempted to reassert himself. This time the response was immediate. No visible strike landed. No dramatic throw unfolded. Instead, the space between intention and execution collapsed. What the challenger meant to do simply failed to manifest. His movements arrived late, meeting positions that had already ceased to exist. Observers later said it felt like watching someone argue with silence. At approximately 11 seconds, though no one was counting, the exchange ended. Not because someone fell. Not because someone was forced away. It ended because continuation no longer made sense. Bruce Lee stepped back. Just one step. Enough to disengage without dismissing. His hands lowered naturally. His posture returned to neutral, as if nothing exceptional had occurred. The challenger stood where he was. Still upright. Still breathing. But something fundamental had shifted. His certainty, once expansive, had narrowed sharply. He did not look injured. He did not look defeated in any obvious way. He looked recalibrated. The room remained silent. No one applauded. No one spoke. They had just witnessed something that resisted explanation, and instinctively, they allowed it to remain undisturbed. The silence did not break on its own. It settled. People remained where they were, uncertain whether the exchange had truly ended or whether acknowledging it would somehow diminish what they had just witnessed. There was no signal to release the tension. No authority stepped forward to interpret events. The room waited for permission that never came. The challenger was the first to move. Not forward. Not away. He adjusted his stance, subtly, as if rediscovering his balance in a body that felt unfamiliar. His breathing was steady, but more deliberate now. The aggression that had shaped his posture earlier had drained away, leaving behind something quieter and heavier. He did not look at Bruce Lee immediately. When he did, it was not with anger. Not even with frustration. It was the look of someone confronting a gap in understanding. Something experienced but not yet integrated. His reputation remained intact in the abstract, but in that room, among those witnesses, it no longer defined him. Bruce Lee said nothing. He did not offer reassurance. He did not explain what had occurred. He did not linger in the center of the space. He moved to the side, retrieving his towel, sipping water, resuming the rhythm of training as though the interruption had been minor. This, more than anything else, confirmed the shift. The challenger had come to force acknowledgement. What he encountered instead was indifference. Not dismissive, but complete. Bruce Lee's refusal to frame the encounter as significant denied the challenger any narrative foothold. There was no conflict to replay, no moment to reinterpret publicly. A few observers later admitted they had expected something else at this point. Words. A lesson spoken aloud. A declaration of superiority. None came. Instead, the room began to breathe again. People shifted. Someone cleared their throat. Another stepped back against the wall. The collective posture of the space relaxed, but the memory of what had occurred did not loosen with it. It stayed, dense and unresolved. The challenger remained for several minutes longer. He did not resume training. He did not leave immediately. He simply stood, watching Bruce Lee move through basic drills, simple footwork, light combinations, nothing performed for effect. It was here that the realization completed its descent. What had happened was not about being beaten. It was about being rendered irrelevant within the exchange. The challenger had not lost visibly, but he had lost narrative control. There was no argument left to make, because the terms themselves had shifted beyond him. Eventually he nodded once. Not in submission. In acknowledgement. He left without explanation. Years later, some would say this was the moment the lesson truly landed. Not in the 11 seconds of contact, but in what followed. The understanding that mastery does not announce itself, and dominance, when real, does not require enforcement. Bruce Lee finished his session quietly. Those who remained did not speak of what they had seen, at least not then. They understood instinctively that naming it too soon would shrink it. Some experiences demand time before language can reach them. The room returned to what it had been. But no one in it ever entered quite the same way again. The room did not survive many more years. It changed locations, changed hands, eventually disappeared altogether, replaced by something more modern, more visible. But those who had been there that afternoon carried it with them, not as a place but as a reference point. They spoke of it rarely. When they did, the details never aligned. Some insisted the exchange was shorter than 11 seconds. Others said it felt longer. A few claimed there had been a decisive movement they alone noticed, something others missed. None of these disagreements mattered. What endured was not the sequence, but the effect. The challenger's name continued to circulate in certain circles. His reputation did not collapse. He taught. He trained. He remained formidable. But those who knew the story noticed a change in how he carried himself afterward. Less need to assert. Less urgency to prove. When asked years later about Bruce Lee, he offered no anecdotes, no explanations, only a pause, and then a quiet acknowledgement of respect. Bruce Lee never spoke of the incident publicly. He did not reference it in interviews. He did not frame it as a turning point. When pressed about challenges or confrontations, he redirected the conversation toward process, toward refinement, toward the work itself. Those close to him understood this was not avoidance. It was consistency. The encounter did not define him because it did not need to. Instead, it became something others used to orient themselves. A story told to students who asked about power. A reminder shared among instructors when discussions drifted toward ego. It was never presented as a victory. It was presented as a demonstration, one that required no embellishment. Years later, when Bruce Lee's name traveled far beyond rooms like that one, the story followed at a distance. It was never told at the front of lectures, never used as evidence. Those who shared it did so only when asked something specific about control, about restraint, about what happens when skill no longer needs permission. Even then, it was told without emphasis, as if the teller were careful not to disturb its shape. What lingered was not admiration. It was calibration. Students who heard the story noticed how it changed the way they trained afterward. Less obsession with winning exchanges. Less fixation on looking decisive. More attention to timing, positioning, economy. More patience. The story did not inspire urgency. It slowed people down. That was its influence. Bruce Lee's approach continued to evolve. He moved away from rigid systems, from fixed identities. He refined principles rather than techniques. Those close to him understood that the encounter in the small room had not altered his path. It had confirmed it. He had already been moving in that direction. The challenger, for his part, was never diminished by the story. If anything, he gained a quieter credibility among those who knew. He had stepped forward when many would not. He had tested himself without spectacle. And when the result arrived, unceremonious and final, he accepted it without protest. That acceptance mattered. Over time, the details thinned. The 11 seconds became symbolic rather than precise. The movements dissolved into implication. What remained was the atmosphere. A room where force met something it could not provoke, where certainty encountered clarity and had nowhere to land. When Bruce Lee passed, the story surfaced again. Not louder, but steadier. It was shared alongside others, not as proof of superiority, but as illustration. A moment when mastery revealed itself not through dominance, but through refusal to escalate. Those who had been present were older then. Some struggled to explain why the memory still felt intact while others had faded. They spoke of it the way people speak of weather events, something witnessed, not owned. No one claimed to understand it fully. That may have been the point. The room is gone now. The witnesses are fewer. But the story continues to travel, unchanged in its restraint. It does not ask to be believed. It simply persists, waiting for those ready to hear what it does not say. And in that persistence, the lesson remains. Quiet, unclaimed, and undefeated.